Okay, well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon now, and I apologize being a few minutes late here. I'm the one with the strange accent, so just to give you a little bit of my background very, very briefly, started off in England, went to South Africa, then went to Zimbabwe, all this time brewing beer, from Zimbabwe to Belgium, where I was working with Stella Artois. From there to back to Africa, this time to Nigeria, Central Africa, a place called Lubumbashi in the Congo, Kenya, Uganda, China, Japan, Scandinavia, Belgium, France and Germany, and finally to the US, where I've been for some time now. So you're probably wondering, and so I'm a gypsy brewer. So when I'm speaking to you about hops here, some of you might have been wondering, why is a big brewer speaking about hops? Because they don't use any hops. Well, we actually do use some hops. We use quite a lot of hops. And so what we want to do is, we can get this on slideshow, is that possible? So what I want to do before 12:55, and I know there's a hard stop then, is to be able to talk about a reasonable amount about hops and why we're very passionate about hops. Because we actually are. So I call this the bitter twisted truth of the hop, and it basically goes into about 50 years of hop chemistry. And the reason 50 years of hop chemistry is because it was about 50 years ago when sort of people started to understand, started to unravel something about hops. And of course, brewers have used hops for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not a couple of thousand years. But it's sort of very important to kind of understand, the various attributes about hops. And the bottom line for this, in case you're wondering what the bottom line is that hops do about 7 things for beer. And this you should remember because it's important. First of all, hops are antimicrobial. So they stop nasty bugs growing in beer. You can't have any pathogenic microorganisms growing in beer like Shigella or Salmonella or Cryptosporidium, because the conditions in beer don't allow pathogenic microorganisms to grow. But you can get nasty things growing in beer which can change the color of the beer, the clarity of the beer, the flavor of the beer, things like this. But hops are sort of antimicrobial, and they do a very reasonable job at being antimicrobial. That's the first thing. Second thing is that hops give a desirable bitterness to beer. Now that can be in various levels, okay, and we can measure the levels both by taste and by chemical means, but the bitterness of beer is very important. There's nothing like hops that can actually simulate the kind of bitterness which you can get from hops. So hops are important for bitterness. Hops are important for flavor and also for aroma. So that's 3 and 4, flavor and aroma. And depending upon the hop variety, depends upon the kind of flavor which you're going to get, the kind of aroma which you're going to get. And there are 3 types of flavor and aroma which you might get, three big categories. One is called spicy, one is called floral, and one is called citrus. So all the flavors of the different types of hops, the hundreds of varieties which are out there, if not thousands of varieties, fall into those 3 categories: spicy, citrus, floral. Spicy can sometimes be herbal, but it's those 3 sort of categories, okay? So that's 4 things that we've looked at. The 5th thing is mouthfeel, the way the beer actually feels in your mouth. And that's very important because at MillerCoors we have quite a lot of patents relating to the mouthfeel of beer and the way that the components of hops actually contribute to that. So that's important for us. And then the 6th thing is that hops are going to contribute to beer foam. Now the main foaming protein in beer, and you've probably heard this, is the lipid transfer protein from barley malt. That's the main foaming protein in beer. The lipid transfer protein is very hydrophobic, which means that it's going to present itself as part of a bubble in beer, okay? So very hydrophobic. The interesting thing about hops and the hop acids are that they're even more hydrophobic. And so they latch on to the hydrophobic protein, lipid transfer protein, and they form part of the bubble wall together with the lipid transfer protein. So we're going to go into that, which is really, really interesting, if not quite sexy. So that's that, okay? So bubbles are sexy, okay? Bubbles are important to beer, all right? So that's the sixth thing. And the seventh thing is flavor stability. You know, we want beer to be able to be fresh. If you have a nice fresh tasting beer from the cellars of MillerCoors, that's about the best beer that you're going to get because it's fresh. Once it's packaged in bottle cans and kegs, it changes with time. It changes with temperature. So fresh beer. And hops, there are parts of hops which will allow beer to be fresh. Okay. So this thing was supposed to be animated, but obviously we haven't done that, so that was a failure. Yeah, I know it's not really doing what it's supposed to do. But anyway, the key was supposed to unlock it. And sort of unlocking 50 years of hop chemistry is related to all these various structures up there. Okay, so that's what you got there. But, okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is hops related to the brewing process. I've done a little bit of an introduction, and I just want you to get the basics of this before we go into the complicated bits, which I'll be delighted to go into you with in excruciating depth. Okay, so first of all, hops are the spice of beer. We all know this. It's like malt is the soul of beer. Hops are the spice of beer. All right. Remember the 7 things which I have said. Okay, I'll just go through them again. Sort of antimicrobial, bitterness, flavor, also aroma, mouthfeel, foam, and flavor stability. I'll keep repeating that as we're going through it, okay? Because there'll be a test, because Professor Steele here is going to give you a test, and that would, so you have to be prepared for that. Okay, so the flowers of hops, or the cones, are of the female plant, okay? And as I said, they provide a distinctive bitterness. There's nothing like hops that can give you this particular bitterness, and distinctive aromas. And one of the things for the future, I'll be giving a lecture on March 28th, as well as today, February 28th. But one of the things I'll be concentrating on is how we're going to make beer in 1,000 years' time. So things like that, you know. And then we've got pellets, and we've got extracts, and we have hop cones. So what I'm going to do, just to kind of get you going with this, is that this is supposed to be sort of interactive. And if we have some kind of a knife or scissors or pen or something which I can rip this thing with, oh, you are such a wonderful man. Thank you very much. Okay, just a second. Just do that and this. So I'll be passing around. Thank you. I'll be passing around hop cones as they grow on vines in the Pacific Northwest in this particular case. So you can rub them, you can smell them, you can eat them if you want to. I'd advise not doing that because they're very, 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 very bitter. But they won't do you any harm. So if I can give that to Professor Steele, and he'll pass that one around. And then you can see what hop pellets look like when those cones are actually compressed. And again, you can rub them, smell them, eat them if you want to, but they are rather bitter. So, and just something to do while I'm kind of talking to you here. All right, so extracts tend to concentrate the bittering components, and we're going to be going into that. And extracts can also be made to be light stable. Light stability is something which is very important for those beers which are packaged in clear glass bottles, and we'll be going through that as we go through this particular lecture. Now, for those of you that haven't seen hops, this is what hops look like in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho in the Pacific Northwest. The majority of hops which we use at MillerCoors come from the Pacific Northwest, but not exclusively from there. Some we have from New Zealand, and some we have from Germany. So there's many, many different hop varieties we use for different beers that we produce. So that's what these vines look like, and we're going to take you sort of through some of that. You can see the hop cones, which I'm passing around, which sort of grow on those vines. And you can see that I've divided certain hop varieties up into sort of aroma types and into bittering types. Now, there's not a hard and fast sort of separation here, because, for example, for, say, Miller Lite, we use Galena hops, which you see on the bittering side, but we regard Galena hops as slightly aromatic. So it depends how you use them and what you use them for. So, but you know, generally speaking, people would look at these particular hop varieties, and there are hundreds of hop varieties out there, but these particular sort of hop varieties and delineate them into aromatic and into bittering. So, and some of the hop varieties, such as Columbus and Zeus there, which you see, are quite rough in terms of their bitterness, whereas Galena is much more of a fine bittering hop. Sarts, which is grown in the Czech Republic, in the Zartek region there, that will be considered to be an aroma type. And then you've got the Hallertau region in Germany, where you've got, you know, different aroma types and also different bittering types as well. But these hop varieties are all completely different. This is looking at hops as they're starting to grow. And typically around about the month of April, hops would start to grow. They'd start to poke through the ground, and then they would start to wind their way up various strings, if you like. Now, the interesting thing, if you want a point of your reference here, is that whether you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, hops are always going to grow up the string in a clockwise direction. That is a fact. So they're going to grow up clockwise as they go up the actual strings there. And eventually we get to harvest. Harvest is typically the month of September. Some of the hop varieties are what we call early varieties, so they can be harvested early. And some of them are late varieties, so they're harvested late. But during the month of September is typical in the Pacific Northwest when hops are harvested. And I would typically take a group of people every year through the hop fields to be able to look at the quality of the hops that we use. So you know, that's important to us there. Okay. Once hops are actually picked, I'll just go back to this thing. You know, what you see here is you see a thing that goes through the hop fields, and what this thing is doing is it's cutting the vines at the top and at the bottom. And then these things fall into this kind of this tray area at the front, if you like, of this particular vehicle. So once they're actually taken from the actual vine, once they're put into this container, then they find their way to what we call a picking machine. And a picking machine is a big machine where the hops go over all sorts of vibrators. So you've got the vine with the hop cones on, and you basically separate the hop cones from the vine is discarded, and the hop cones get cleaned up with all the other hop residue, if you like, as they're going through this picking machine. So on the left-hand side here, you see where the hops are the hop cones are stripped from the vines, and on the right-hand side, you get the separation from the leafy material and things like that. And it's a very noisy thing to go through a hop picking area. And the hop picking area, and these are very expensive machines, are actually only used for about 6 weeks every year. That's when the hop harvest is. So so that's what happens to be able to clean up the hop cones, which I'm passing around, and to make sure that they are totally clean. Then what happens is the hops are kilned. They kind of go into a big area where they're kind of heated up on beds. The idea there is to be able to stop growth activity, if you like, and to stop them deteriorating. So they go into this kiln and they get heated up, and that basically arrests the hops, if you like. And then after that, they're actually put into bales. So at the bottom of this slide, what you're seeing are these cones. What you're seeing here, cones, but compressed into bales, 200-pound bales. Okay, so each of these bales here in the US is 200 pounds. And the big bricks of hops, which are compressed into these bales. And then you have typically sacking or plastic material that covers the bales to keep them in. And that's what happens there. So every year, this is what I take a group of people around the hop fields to actually go and see. These are the hop cones which I'm passing around. Those are compressed into pellets. And then if you take a hop cone and you cut it open, what you're going to then look at is you're going to look at some real sort of hop magic here. Because what you're seeing there is you're seeing these golden glands inside the hop cone. These are called lupulin glands. And the lupulin glands are very, very important for brewing. They contain alpha and beta resins, they contain hop oils, and they contain tannins. And so the lupulin glands are very important. And when we extract hops, and I'll take you through extraction in a second, when we extract hops, we're kind of extracting what is in those lupulin glands. That's important there. All right, but remember the alpha acids and the beta acids and the hop oils and the tannins, because these are the things which are important when we go forward. So if you take the brewing process, and this is showing you the brewing process, typically hops would be added in the brew kettle, and you probably are very well aware of that. So you've got the brew kettle there, in the brew house, and then you go on to fermentation, and you go on to storage, lagering, maturation, and things like that. So that's traditionally where hops would be added, and for many beers, hops are still added at that brew kettle when the wort is being actually boiled. But hops, and this shows you here a typical brew kettle. This is out of the Milwaukee brewery, where the wort is sterilized, you get protein coagulation, you add your hops, you get hop extraction and conversion, and we'll go through the conversion in a second, and you get volatile removals. Typically you've got sort of volatiles in the hops which you don't want. One of the volatiles is a compound which we call myrcene, and that can give you headaches, so you don't want too much myrcene in a beer. So we typically volatilize off some of that myrcene during the kettle boil. And this is the second place where you can add hops. If you extract hops and you make special hop extracts, you can actually add hops after fermentation. And we do that for several reasons. We might want to be able to augment beer foam, and we use a particular hydrophobic hop extract for doing that. Or there might be post-fermentation bittering, or there might be post-fermentation aromas that we want to add, such as in hop oils and so on. So there's two places where hops can be added, in the brew kettle and after fermentation as a post-fermentation add. So that would be typical about where brewers add hops. Now you might say, well, that's what a large brewer would do, but small brewers don't do that. They just use hops in the brew kettle. Well, that's actually not true, because more and more brewers are actually using hops as a post-fermentation add, which is actually very interesting, and something which my microbrewer friends keep on telling me and reinforcing. So we were talking about the fact that we've had 50 years of hop chemistry, and so we might not be able to get through all this presentation today, but what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the characterization of bittering acids. I want to talk about improved utilization, which is very short. I'll talk about light stability or instability, to talk about organic solvent-free hop products, to talk more about beer bubbles, because it's a passion of mine, and the antimicrobial nature of hops, and then to talk about flavor and flavor stability. And we're going to be doing all of that in less than half an hour, which is a wonderful thing. You'll have this lecture to read whenever you want to read it, but it is a pretty good summation about hops. So if we talk about the characterization of bittering acids, first of all, we've got alpha acids. Alpha acids are known as humulone. So you've got this quite traditional name of the alpha acids, and it's called humulone. And it basically comes in sort of three forms. It comes in a co-form, an N form, and an add form. It's just slight differences in the structure of the humulone. The basic structure is always the same, but there's slight differences with respect to the R group there and what gets attached to the R group there. So that's the co-form, the N form, and then the add form. And that becomes quite important to the brewer, because particularly a brewer such as Anheuser-Busch places a lot of emphasis on the co-form of humulone, or the co-form of alpha acids, in terms of what they believe is good for beer foam or good for the kind of bitterness. We don't necessarily subscribe to that, but there are brewers that place a lot of emphasis on making sure that with the co-form that they have a fairly low co-isoalpha acid, and that becomes quite important. Now, what happens is that the humulone, or the alpha acid in the kettle boil, becomes isomerized. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at the difference between the alpha acid structure here, which is a 6-ring structure, and once it becomes isomerized, which becomes a 5-ring structure. Now that happens during the kettle boil, that happens with heat. And the reason it kind of happens is because what we want is to take advantage of the alpha acid. Hops are bitter anyway, but now we want those sort of alpha acids to become even more bitter. And the isoalpha acids are what typically gives beer its actual bittering. Now, the isoalpha acids are something which can be there in a large amount or in a small amount. So if you take a Miller Lite, Bud Light, Coors Light, typically there you're looking at a measurement, a chemical measurement of about 6 ppm of isoalpha acids. So six bitterness units, if you like, you know. And so that's the amount of bittering there. Whereas you look at something like Pilsner Urquell from the Czech Republic, and that has 39 ppm of isoalpha acids. So it's a very bitter beer. And for those of you that like Pilsner Urquell, that's its complexity. The complexity of Pilsner Urquell has nothing whatsoever to do with the alcohol content, but it has everything to do with the hops, the Saaz hops, which go into that particular beer, which actually give it its characteristic bitterness as well as its characteristic flavor. So that's important there. So the isoalpha acids, this was discovered about 50 years ago, that sort of alpha acids during the kettle boil get turned into isoalpha acids. Now what's important here is that if you look at the isoalpha acids, that leg that kind of hangs down sort of at the bottom of the structure there is what we call the isoprenyl leg. The isoprenyl leg is very, very important because because when we get to light stability, we're going to be talking about that leg, and you'll see that there's an oxygen group there, and you'll see there's a couple of double bonds there, and so on. We're going to talk about the saturation of those in the course of time. But right now, suffice to say that once we get the alpha acids into isoalpha acids, we get a change in the actual structure, and we get this isoprenyl leg, which actually is important to other properties of beer, and we'll get there later. All right, now what you should also realize is that the alpha acids, when they get changed into isoalpha acids by heat, is that there are two optical forms. There's a trans form and there's a cis form. Now there's a lot of debate right now as to whether the trans form is more important than the cis form, or the cis form is more important than the trans form. The fact of the matter is that they're both the same. It's just that they're optically different. And so right now in hop research, and we do a lot of hop research, we have a lot of patents on this, is that we're doing a lot of work to determine whether or not the trans form is more or less important than the cis form. And it's thought that when it comes to, or at least we think, when it comes to flavor stability, that if you have the trans form is the more common form, is that this allows the flavor to break down much more quickly than the cis form. So there's things like that which we're kind of currently researching. But all you have to remember is that there's these optical forms, trans and cis, and that may or may not be important to the brewer. Then you've got lupulone, or the beta acids, okay? So the beta acids also come in a co-form, an N form, and an add form. So you've got co, N, and add lupulone. But the beta acids in hops have historically been totally useless. they haven't done anything for beer. And in fact, during the kettle boil, they tend to precipitate out. So, from a historical perspective, the beta acids are absolutely useless, but I'm going to show you later on how we make them useful. Okay, so, but right now, except that the traditional brewer has no time for a lupulone or the beta acids, because the traditional brewer considers them to be pretty useless. All right, so from the 1950s, we have had improved utilization. So in other words, you add hops to the kettle, to the wort in the kettle. You kind of boil up the wort, you extract what's in the hops. So you're extracting the alpha acids, you're turning the alpha acids into isoalpha acids. But the problem is that when you measure the efficiency of that, you tend to get about a 30% efficiency. It's not very efficient. That particular reaction of turning alpha acids into isoalpha acids is just not very efficient. So because it's not very efficient, and of course brewers, you want to be efficient, there's been lots of discussion about how to be able to make that to be a much more efficient exercise. And so consequently, what's been happening is that you've got all sorts of solvents which have been used to be able to try to concentrate up alpha acids to see whether you can make it more efficient. And in years gone by, you've had all sorts of really, really nasty solvents that have been used, such as methylene chloride and such as hexane. They haven't been particularly nice solvents to use. These days we use carbon dioxide, but in years gone by, we have used these nasty solvents. But also, so what you have been able to do is you've been able to take the hop cone, make a hop pellet, which you've seen, and then you take that pellet and you heat the pellet under controlled conditions. And if you heat the pellet under controlled conditions, you're going to isomerize the actual alpha acids. And if you isomerize the alpha acids, where you have isoalpha acids inside the hop pellet, then that's going to give you a more efficient use of hops when you add the hop pellets to the wort boil. So the way that you do that is very easy. You just use basically magnesium oxide to be able to mix the hop cone material as it's being made into a pellet, and you just heat it up. And that that isomerizes the alpha acids. And instead of having like 30% efficiency or thereabouts, you'll get much more efficiency depending upon the extent to which you isomerize the alpha acids in the actual pellet. So that's one way of being able to use hops better. And a guy called Bernd Grant of the SS Steiner Company, who's dead now, but he actually had that patent and was able to charge brewers around the world for isomerized hop pellets. So there's money to be made here. There kind of really is. And you can see the pellets below there. So, light struck flavor. Well, if you kind of take a beer in a clear glass bottle, sunlight is going to make it go skunky if the beer is normally hopped. And so that's a reaction, basically, of light shining on that hop component, that's of isoalpha acid. And you know that we mentioned the isoprenyl leg there. Well, that leg tends to break off, and it tends to react with sulfur compounds, and you form a compound which is called 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol. And 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol, which is skunky flavor, horrible flavor, you can taste at parts per trillion. Okay, so light stability. All right, so let's go on this. Okay, it was known in the 1950s that isoalpha acids and sulfur could cause this 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol. We didn't actually know what it was at the time. We could just smell it, okay? And it was the Kirin Brewery Company that did a lot of work to be able to define this sunstruck flavor or this skunky flavor as being 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol. or as we call it, 3M2B1T, you know, but anyway, 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol. Any beer will actually do this. You take a bottle of Corona in a clear glass bottle, and you put that bottle of Corona, well, you take 2 bottles, you put one in the sunlight for 2 minutes, and you keep one in the dark. And after 2 minutes in the sunlight, that particular bottle of Corona will be sunstruck. So then you're able to go into a room such as this and taste both beers, and you'll find that one is actually relatively nice tasting, but the other one has got this skunky flavor. Happens in minutes, and so it's not very nice indeed. And so what you're looking at there is you're looking at the way you've got your isoalpha acids towards the bottom of the slide there, and you've got that reaction with sulfur compounds. There's always sulfur compounds in beer. There's, you know, always sulfur compounds in beer. And so with those sulfur compounds, you get 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol. Skunky flavor. Not something that we actually want. What we did way back was that we decided that we didn't like beer with skunky flavor, so we started to look at how we can take that isoprenyl leg there and stabilize it. And we found that we could stabilize it by actually reducing it. You can see where the arrow is there. If you saturate that, what you're going to find is you kind of render that isoprenyl leg stable, so it won't react with sulfur compounds. Now in the early days, they used sodium borohydride for doing that, as a reducing agent to be able to render that isoprenyl leg stable. Of course, you know, sodium borohydride chemicals, not a good way of doing it, but it worked. It worked, and it changed the isoalpha acids into what we call Rho isoalpha acids. And even today, there are forms of Rho isoalpha acids that brewers actually use to stop beer from going light stable, okay, to make them light stable. So that was the early attempt of actually doing that. And we're going to show you a more sophisticated attempt of doing that, which is currently in use. We go to 1975, and there was a guy over in England, his name was Derek Laws, working with a guy called Richard Sharp, and they started to make CO2 hop extracts. So basically you're taking liquid CO2 and you're passing it through hops, and you get a liquid CO2 hop extract. The CO2 can be recovered, and which can be used again. There's a certain loss, but you end up with a CO2 hop extract. Now, if you do this under different temperatures and different pressures, you can be more or less efficient in the way that you do that. So what that slide is showing there, you know, is that you can have what we call liquid CO2 extract, or you can have supercritical CO2 extract. The only difference is the difference in temperatures and pressures at which you extract the actual hops, the hop cones, or the hop pellets in this case. So a typical liquid CO2 extract would look golden in color. But if you ramp up the temperature and ramp up the pressure, you're going to start extracting some of that chlorophyll and everything else. So it's going to be a greener hop extract, but you're going to extract more. And so supercritical CO2 extracts are typical of what your brewers use, because it's efficient for the person doing the actual extraction using liquid CO2 to be able to use supercritical methods. So, but again, you've got the liquid CO2, the extract, you've got the supercritical CO2 extract. The only difference is differences in temperature and pressure. Now, so you take your hops, you extract using CO2 under normal conditions or under supercritical conditions, you end up with a CO2 extract here. And you end up with what we call a cellulose portion, spent hops or hop solids. For quite a long time, people thought the hop solids were completely useless, and we have been used as animal feed. I'll take you through later why they might be actually very useful. But it's taken us a while to be able to find that out. But typically, what a brewer would actually use, and microbrewers as well as big brewers, is a CO2 hop extract, because cones are difficult to handle in a big amount. Very, very difficult to handle. Pellets are much better because they're compressed, so it's much more ergonomic that way. But extracts are even better to be able to handle, which is why brewers tend to use more extracts these days. Okay, this is we're showing you what can be done to be able to form. We spoke about row isoalpha acids, which we said were relatively light stable using sodium borohydride. I'm going to take you into another form now, which we call tetrahydroisoalpha acids, which is this thing here. And what you're doing here is you're stabilizing the isoprenar leg, not at this point, which is where we did it with the row isoalpha acids, but at this point here. We also stabilize this one here. So we saturate that double bond, we saturate this double bond. This actually again renders the leg stable, and that means it's light stable like the row isoalpha acids. We're not going to go into the history here. But the point being is that tetrahydroisoalpha acids are what the majority of brewers now use if they want their beers to be light stable. Corona doesn't use it, but you have got these tetrahydroisoalpha acids in, say, Miller High Life, or in sort of other types of beers which are totally light stable. So Miller High Life has a clear glass bottle. You can put that in the sun; it won't go skunky ever, because of the tetrahydroisoalpha acids. So that is an efficient way of being able to make sure that your consumer loves you, because most consumers don't like skunky beer. Some do, but most consumers don't. Okay? All right, and this is the chemistry. You're taking your alpha acids and you're turning them into isoalpha acids, and from your isoalpha acids you use a hydrogen with palladium on carbon catalyst. Catalyst comes out, so there's nothing left there, and you end up with a pure sort of extract of tetrahydroisoalpha acids, totally light stable, totally light stable. Row isoalpha acids extracted with the sodium borohydride, not always completely light stable because it depends upon how efficient the actual reaction is. But this is actually very efficient, and so because it always goes to completion, and so the tetrahydroisoalpha acids are always light stable. Now you can go further and you can reduce even further to a thing called hexahydroisoalpha acids, but we don't need to worry about that. But I told you earlier that in hops you've got your alpha acids and you've got your beta acids. And I said the alpha acids have always been considered to be useful by the brewer, and the beta acids have been useless. Well, we found a way of being able to turn the beta acids also into tetrahydroisoalpha acids. And so we can do that very efficiently. So we're taking a useless product, or something which has been considered to be useless, and in Watertown, Wisconsin, we changed the beta acids into tetrahydroisoalpha acids. The same tetrahydroisoalpha acids you get from the alpha acids. And there's a couple of other compounds also that we can get out of this, and one's called hexahydrobeta acids, which is very antimicrobial. And we'll talk later on about that when we won't have time to do that. But anyway, that's something perhaps for another day. But again, it's using hydrogen, so you're just taking a palladium on carbon catalyst. You're actually bubbling hydrogen through this hop extract with the palladium on carbon catalyst, separating out the catalyst, which can be used again. It's just filtered out. And then you've hydrogenated your hops to get to your tetrahydroisoalpha acids. I'm going to go just one step further here before we finish here. This is the last slide which I'll show you today, because it's quite an important slide. In fact, I'll just, your last slide here. Along, this axis here, you've got what we call analytical bitterness units, going from 0 up to 30. Along this axis here, you've got sensory bitterness units, how the beer actually tastes. Normally speaking, if you take isoalpha acids, which is in the middle of there, if you've got a value of 10 bitterness units, then that's going to give you a sensorial bitterness of approximately 10 in terms of scale, okay? Whereas your row isoalpha acids, if you've got 10 bitterness units in your row isoalpha acids, the bitterness of your row isoalpha acids is actually less. It's around about 8.5, 9, something like that. Slightly less bitter than your isoalpha acids. But if you take your tetrahydroisoalpha acids and you have a value of 10, you're much, much more bitter in terms of your sensory, the way that you perceive the sensory bitterness. So in fact, a value of 10 in terms of isoalpha acids is somewhere between 15 and 17 sensory bitterness units. What that means is that you can use tetrahydroisoalpha acids very efficiently to be able to give you a certain bitterness in hops. I'm going to stop there because my time is, I'll continue for just a little while, shall I?
5 more minutes.
Yeah, I got 5 more minutes. I got 5 more minutes, yeah. Okay, so it's a good thing. All right, so I'm going to just continue a little bit further. So we get to intensity of bitterness, okay? And Tom Shellhammer at Oregon State University concurs with us that as to what I've just shown you, and that's if my animation will work, which it will not. Whoops, sorry. Okay, hang on. It will get there. I apologize. Is that tetrahydroisoalpha acids are more bitter than hexahydroisoalpha acids, which are more bitter than isoalpha acids, which are more bitter than the row isoalpha acids. Traditional brewers would only use your isoalpha acids because that's what you're converting the alpha acids into during the kettle boil. But we can use these other compounds to be able to use them even more efficiently should we wish, and with the tetra to be able to get complete light stability so we never get skunky beer. So that's important. Okay, all right. Yeah, so what you're seeing here is that you don't get any reaction with sunlight or a UV light with that isoprenyl leg there. So you don't get 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol. We also discovered that there are 2 other compounds which are related to 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol, which are on the right side of the screen there. The 3-methyl-2-butene-methyl disulfide and the 3-methyl-2-butene-methyl trisulfide also give you the same kind of skunky flavor. We don't get any of those, which so the beer doesn't become skunky. For the beer which we produce in a clear glass bottle. But that's important sort of hop chemistry there. Okay, let's go forward here. Foam improvement, just a little bit about foam, because foam is it's just very sexy, it really is. And that's that tetrahydroisoalpha acids. And I mentioned to you before that isoalpha acids are very hydrophobic. So they're going to latch onto that lipid transfer protein, and you'll see a very visible foam. The more isoalpha acids you actually have there, the more foam you'll see. So if we take a typical German beer, that might be at, say, 25 bitterness units, more than, say, a MillerCoors like Bud Light, you'll see more foam in that typical German beer due to the fact you got those isoalpha acids latching on to that lipid transfer protein to make it more hydrophobic. Tetrahydroisoalpha acids are even more hydrophobic. And so this is interesting because brewers, by having a post-fermentation addition, a small amount of tetrahydroisoalpha acids can actually make sure the beer is foaming nicely. Heineken, for example, have used this to just add a small amount of tetrahydroisoalpha acids so the Heineken beer foams more. So if you consider that foam is a desirable character of beer, and some of you might and some of you might not, I do, if you want a nice foaming beer, then a little bit of tetrahydroisoalpha acids actually does wonders to beer. And it just stops the beer it stops the foam breaking down with age. If you take your beer in a package, The foaming properties of beer will break down as the beer gets older, but with tetrahydroisoalpha acids, it tends to protect the foam. That's what that slide's showing there. So I am definitely going to stop at this particular moment because we're going to get on to the next subject is antimicrobial conditions here, which is rather a long section, and I'm conscious of your time and the fact that you need lunch or something. So anyway, are there any brief questions before we kind of finish here? So any questions at all? Yes, sir.
When you said you added a lot of hops after fermentation, would that be considered a dry hopping process?
Can be. Dry hops is just for those of you that are familiar with the term. What you're going to do is with a beer, a fully fermented beer, you might transfer it to an aging tank where there are hop cones or hop pellets, and that would be called a dry hopping. So you're going to add those hop cones or hop pellets into the aging tank as the beer goes on top of it, and then you get this dry hop character, depending on variety, coming out of the actual beer itself. But that's a great question. In this case, we're also talking about special extracts that can be added post-fermentation. Thank you for the question. Thanks for your indulgence, and we'll see you again.